product together in a form that would actually become entertaining to students from other classes. The whole process, in short, was something very much akin to the process of adapting a text to a film that would be undergone by professional filmmakers, screenwriters, etc. The collaboration element mimicked the whole idea of creative artists getting together and producing what they thought was the right version, and presenting the finished product forced them to listen to the comments of their peers, just as filmmakers would if they showed their material to professional critics or others. The big difference between this form of work and the form of work that I had done in my first adaptation projects was the fact that the learners themselves were mostly free to do precisely as they wished, whereas I became something of a peripheral figure at the side of the classroom, watching and admiring, it must be said, what the learners were actually doing. Since 2006, I have done similar activities with learners in different classes and at different levels. But my pedagogy has moved slightly. Whereas in 2006, I still use the text as a basis for constructing adaptation activities. Now I invite learners to choose their own texts, the only stipulation being that they should be A, related to some kind of literary topic, and B, that such texts should at least be well known to other learners so as to render what the learners themselves are doing accessible. When I ask learners to work on those texts now, I still invite them to write their own adaptations, but now I also encourage them to think about the activities as a life learning exercise. What they are doing within the classroom is not something that will be examined and forgotten about at the end of the course, but provide the basis for a form of learning that will continue beyond their university education and into their working lives. As most of them will become teachers, that involves encouraging them to focus on non-verbal communication, on the use of gesture, on the use of mimics, on the use of facial expressions, and making use of the eyes. One of the things I've learned, especially since my operation, is the importance of the eyes as a mode of being able to influence people and to make people understand what you're talking about. And so in recent activities with learners, I sometimes ask them to do silent activities. I sometimes ask them perhaps to do half silent, half verbal activities. What I also ask learners to do is to become more self-reflective, which means perhaps creating logs at the end of each block of 3 weeks within a 12-week term. These logs invite them to reflect, either in English or in Turkish, on what they have done, why they are doing it, and what it has done to contribute to their overall lives. This is again something which is not easy for learners who, although they talk with their teachers about their pedagogic performance in teacher training classes, are often unacquainted with the idea that actually the most important mentor in the teaching act or in the adaptive act is yourself. What I have to say, or what other educators have to say, is important perhaps, but is incidental. The learners themselves have to understand what they have done and what means they can do to improve themselves. So the classes now are not only exercises in performance rehearsal and performance themselves, but also exercises in self-reflection. They're exercises in trying to work out the WH questions. Why are we doing this? What does it tell us about the adaptive process? How does adaptation influence our lives? And this is where the work of Piaget and Bruner becomes important, as they learn a lot about how adaptation itself is something that's a lifelong process and will involve them in processes of change that will go on from their early 20s when they leave the universities to their late 50s or early 60s when they retire. Now, that is one way of working, but I can sense that there might be objections. I have to admit that I'm in a privileged position. I have the total freedom to be able to plan my classes. I don't have to do written examinations. I also work with small groups of students, 20 at the most, which means I can get to know the students and perhaps be able to understand what they are thinking about their own future careers. Well, the question, I think, is whether these modes of learning, adaptation focused, can be used within large classes in cultures where exams, written exams especially, are mandatory. I think you can work with large classes, provided you are brave enough to divide the learners into groups and to be able to empower those groups to be able to work on their own. It might involve a bit of coaching initially and a bit of teacher-centered encouragement, but I still think that learners themselves can be encouraged to negotiate amongst themselves as to how a text might be adapted. I also think that mobile technology is an absolute boon towards helping learners share their activities with one another and comment on each other's work, and that can be done in large classes as well as small classes. As far as written exams are concerned, it is possible, for example, to ask the WH questions in a written question as it is in an oral question. So the WH questions: why have you done this? What have you learned from it? How are you going to be able to use this in your professional life? Can be done in written questions. How do you assess these written questions? Well, I think it is possible to be able to put a series of standards by which a learner's performance within an adaptation class can be measured. Those standards could include ability to communicate, ability to negotiate, ability to be able to use material in a creative way. How can a teacher be able to measure such standards? Well, a teacher can give an assessment grade, let's say out of 5, and then perhaps negotiate with the learner to be able to see what might be the fairest type of grade. I have seen this type of negotiation used within larger classes. It's time-consuming, but ultimately it's the sort of thing that is considered fair. Finally, I'd like to say that this form of adaptation is something which I think can be used to defend the discipline against the oft-invoked question, what is adaptation studies for? Well, I can say that the pedagogies that I try to use answer that question by saying it is something, a form of learning that can be used to develop life skills, and that those life skills are something that are as applicable when you've left university as when as you've begun it. Thank you. 32, 37.